Okay, I'll try and whip through the front half of this, all the methodology, etc., and get to the crux of it. So this really looked at our My View survey. So this is an existing survey that we do of all CDU students in their unit of study. It's conducted every semester of all units and all students. What we were looking for is to really understand whether that sub-cohort of Indigenous students were adequately represented, and adequate in itself is an interesting word, adequately represented within the survey for a range of reasons. So first of all, I guess just some background, and I'm sure you've probably heard this in multiple presentations today, so I won't labour on it too long. But essentially, clearly government policy is leading down the path of evidence or outcome-based linked funding. The Indigenous Student Success or Support, I can't remember which word they're using these days, program is already linked to outcome-based funding, and the broader university-based funding from government is clearly moving in that direction also. That means that universities obviously need to start to improve student outcomes if they want to continue to receive and increase their funding base. And so in the past, and I've seen this, but not just at CDU, but across a range of universities, we have a tendency to adopt Me Too strategies when we implement things like retention strategies and student success programs. So we look at things that have worked elsewhere and we say, let's give that a go at our university and see if it works. The risk with that obviously is if our student cohort here is significantly different to the cohort at the university where the success occurred, then potentially we're wasting time and resources in putting in place a program that isn't fit for purpose for our student cohort. It's a risk, it's not a foregone conclusion, but it's a risk. The timing of the funding, the outcome-based funding, means that we probably don't have the luxury to sit and suck it and see and put a few things in place and see which ones work. We actually need to know they're going to work. It also means we have some limited time to go out and do new research. So this was sort of understanding, do we have an existing body of evidence that we might be able to use now to develop some strategies, with the view that we might do some longer term, more detailed research. We looked at our unit evaluation surveys on the basis that most universities have these as a resource. They already use them and use them for a range of sort of continuous improvement activities across the teaching and learning experience. But the question mark is really, are they fit for purpose in the context of, are they fit for purpose for improving broad student outcomes in retention and success, and are they fit for purpose in representing Indigenous students and improving Indigenous student outcomes? We looked at My View data at CDU, so it was a case study based approach just looking at CDU. And I guess why CDU? Essentially CDU has the highest access and participation rates for higher education institutions across the country. 6.8% of all of our domestic enrolments at CDU are Indigenous students, compared to just 1.6% in the sector. But our trends in terms of participation, retention and success rates are sort of in line with the trends that you see in the national average. The gap that you see in the national average between the student outcomes that for Indigenous students compared to non-Indigenous students also exists at CDU. There's about a 7 to 8% gap between the student outcomes that you see in the non-Indigenous student cohort in terms of success rates, retention rates and completion rates than there is for the Indigenous student cohort. So it seemed like a small micro case study that we could look at that might then lead to some further research. So the questions we asked are students in our unit evaluation surveys, are they representative enough of Indigenous students to be confidently used in the formulation and measurement of programs designed to improve student outcomes? And I guess that was at a whole range of levels. So one is, when we're using the data to formulate whole of university strategy, can we be confident that the voice of Indigenous students is representative within that survey? The second part is then, could we pull out the Indigenous student responses and actually use those in isolation? So what we're looking at there is, rather than representativeness, I guess it's the reliability of the data in terms of its statistical reliability to represent that cohort itself. And then looking at the representativeness of sub-cohorts within that, so gender, fields of education, those sorts of things, to understand whether there's some potential non-response bias in the surveys to sort of say, yes, they're representative statistically, but no, they're not representative because there's a group of students that are missing and they actually might be very different to the group that are responding. And finally, going to the heart of what we're actually trying to do with our policy and improvement in terms of improving student success rates and retention, are those students that are not successful and not being retained actually represented in the survey, both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. We looked at My View survey over a 3-year period, so 2015 to 2017, and that sort of just gives you an idea of the overall population in the survey responses. So we send out about 20,000 surveys each semester, and we get about between 7,000 and 8,000 survey responses each semester back. In terms of measuring representativeness, at that whole of university level, we looked at the proportion of the cohort, i.e. Indigenous students, or we also compared it to international students. So the representativeness or proportion of those cohorts as a proportion of the total survey population and as a proportion of the total response population. So looking at the difference between those. And also then looked at the change that would be required in the response rate to actually achieve representativeness as measured the first way. So I guess that looked at the effort that would be required to lift that survey response rate up to representativeness. The second thing we looked at is then to understand that reliability of the data to be able to be pulled out and used, say, just for looking at Indigenous students, was looking at confidence intervals, and I'll describe those a little bit later. And that was also then to help us understand whether there was some potential non-response bias, and we then also looked at the study characteristics, which I think are on my next slide. So these range of study characteristics to understand broader representativeness within the sub-cohorts. We also looked at success rates. So we measured success using two factors which are fairly common to be used across the higher ed sector. So one was GPA, and looking at the GPA of the student in the year of the survey. And the other was looking at the aggregate pass-fail. So on a whole, did they pass, or on a whole, did they fail the aggregate of the units that they took in that year? We also looked at retention rate in the year following their participation in the survey. So if they participated in 2007, were they retained in the following academic year? Research limitations. Obviously, one university, hard to draw broad national conclusions when you're looking at just one single university. So this may actually lead to further inquiries, the likes of Fiona's research, where we sort of included other similar universities like CQU. What we're doing here is, I guess, hypothesising that non-response bias exists and using some evidence to try and determine, yes, it does exist. We're not defining what it is, though, and the nature of that non-response bias. That would actually require a different kind of analysis. And what we're also not testing is the appropriateness of the tool, i.e. are the questions the right questions to ask if you actually want to formulate research policy or, retention policy or retention strategies. So, first question. Were Indigenous students adequately represented? So this was just looking at, are the proportion of Indigenous students in the wider student body the same as the proportion of students that are in the response rate, response population for the survey? This is the overall representativeness of the survey in individual periods. So this is the eligible survey population, and this is the proportion this is the proportion in the population, and this is the proportion, I'm going to try not to touch the screen, and this is the proportion in the response rates. So the gap between these two lines is your underrepresentation, and this is across each of the individual collection periods that we looked at in the data. So consistently across the board, Indigenous students were underrepresented by, this is sort of 3.5 and this is 4%. So they represent about 4% of our Indigenous, of our total students, and about 3.5% of the responses. what does that look like when you say compare it to international students? Interestingly, this difference is about 30 responses. So it's actually not a lot. We'd actually only need 30 additional responses from Indigenous students to actually make that representative. The question is the effort that would be required to actually achieve those 30 additional responses. And when you compare it to the change in response rate that would be required and compare it to, say, international students. So by comparison, international students are underrepresented by about 30%. And we would need about 300 extra international student responses to make international students representative within the whole survey population. So it seems like a task that's about 10 times the size. But because that cohort is much larger, achieving those 300 extra responses is much easier, or about the same, as achieving 30 from the Indigenous student cohort. So this is a calculation that we did that aims to try and normalise those sizes of the cohort, and actually says that the effort required to achieve representativeness for international students versus Indigenous students is about the same, even though the numbers are quite different. So first conclusion really there was that yes, they are underrepresented consistently. The second question was then, okay, they're underrepresented, but what if we pulled out just the responses from the Indigenous students? Could we use those in isolation to formulate Indigenous student success strategies? Because ultimately, when we pull them out, their voice isn't being hidden by anyone else's voice that might be overshadowing or overrepresented. So we use confidence intervals to look at that. So confidence intervals really look at the response rates in relation to the population and understand that how reliable is the answer the student is giving you. I'm trying to explain this in layman terms. And so it gives you a range. So to say, if the response you got was 85% of students are really happy with their experience, then we can be 95% confident that if we surveyed every single student in that survey population and they all responded, the real answer we would get would be within this certain range. So you do that for each individual question, and because we had multiple survey periods and multiple questions, there's multiple confidence intervals. So we calculated, I think, some 600 confidence intervals and got an average, minimum and maximum confidence interval. So at worst, the gap or the confidence interval is about 5%, and at best it's about 10%. Sorry, other way around. At best it's about 5%, and at worst it's about 10%. So compared to the non-Indigenous and international students, again, much larger student cohorts. So once you get over a certain threshold with a number of responses, it's sort of diminishing returns in terms of reliability. So clearly there is some reliability issues in terms of just pulling out those Indigenous student responses and using them in isolation to formulate strategy for Indigenous students. So this is what that range looks like if you pick up the average. So you can see it's about double the range, but it's still not woeful. I've actually seen worse confidence intervals used for formulating policy and strategy. So then I looked at the representativeness of the various different sub-cohorts within the Indigenous student and other two cohorts, so non-Indigenous and international, to really understand, was there potentially some non-response bias? Are there particular students that are not responding that actually might mean, even if we've got the tiniest of confidence intervals, we still probably shouldn't use the data because there's potentially types of students that are missing that might have an experience that is really different to those that are responding. So we looked at age, and I think there was I wouldn't say it's completely unexpected, but I was surprised. Young students are far less likely to respond to the surveys and are far more underrepresented across the board. So this is Indigenous students, non-Indigenous and international. So regardless of which cohort you belong to, if you are under 30, you're far less likely to participate and respond to a MyView survey, which says that young group of students their voice is less represented within those responses. The next thing I looked at is the regional and remoteness of the student's home location. So again, similar patterns between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. International are missing because obviously their home location is not in Australia. But interestingly, remote students participating at higher rates in the MyView survey than their inner and outer regional students, Indigenous students. However, inner regional non-Indigenous students participating at much higher rates. So you'd say this inner and outer regional probably for Indigenous students are underrepresented. Males and females, both males and females are underrepresented against this benchmark. Sorry, I should have explained the benchmark. The benchmark is basically the average for the whole of the survey. But the pattern of underrepresentation is fairly consistent across the three cohorts. So you would say gender is not a factor. AQF level, this one, again, the pattern very similar across the three cohorts, with the exception of AQF level 6, which seems to be significantly overrepresented for Indigenous students. That said, very, very small number of students in that particular cohort, so I think it's probably a bit of a statistical anomaly that you're seeing there, so we sort of discounted that in the results. Socioeconomic status of students, all socioeconomic statuses are underrepresented for Indigenous students in comparison to non-Indigenous who are all above the benchmark. Again, international students not having a postcode or an address in Australia don't get classified in socioeconomic status. But the general pattern in terms of representativeness across the categories is similar between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. In terms of fields of education, I haven't got a graph there because there was lots of them. We used an intuitive field of education classification, so rather than using the government broad, narrow and detailed, we used a more intuitive one which combines broad, narrow and detailed to sort of say, well, for education we're happy to use broad, but for society and culture we actually want to separate out law from social work and those types of things. So generally speaking, there was not a lot in the fields of education that suggested certain fields were over or underrepresented, with the exception of education and psychology disciplines, which were significantly underrepresented in the data. So then we looked at the key part of it, which was really for those students that are not successful or not being retained, can this data be used to try and capture their voice, be them Indigenous or not, to start to formulate or at least give us some hints as to what we should be doing to improve student outcomes. So we looked first of all at GPA. So these are your lowest GPA to highest GPA, Indigenous, non-Indigenous and international students, and I think it's 3.9 is your sort of crux between fail and not. And so across the board, again, same pattern, but it's clearly those students that are low GPAs and failing are those that are not responding to surveys. If you then aggregate that and just say between fail on the whole or pass on a whole, those students that are failing on the whole across all three cohorts are the ones that are not responding. All of the pass students are actually either representative or overrepresented, and actually even Indigenous students that are passing are overrepresented within the survey population. We then looked at retention, so looking at whether they were retained in the year following their participation in the survey or whether they completed, they were taken out. And again, it's those students that withdraw in the following year that are not represented in the year that they are still enrolled. So it is a predictor, you would say, of future withdrawal is non-participation in the MyView surveys. Your completion and retain, with the exception of international students, which is slightly under the benchmark, for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, your successful or retained students are actually overrepresented within the survey population. So what happens if you take out the non-retained and non-successful, so failing on aggregate students across all of the three cohorts, and say, well, if we just use the data about successful students, well, actually, Indigenous students are representative within the survey population. Their voice is there if the survey is representing successful and retained students. So what that tells us, if at the unit level, at the university level, at the discipline area, if we're using these surveys to understand what a successful student wants, what a retained student wants and needs, then Indigenous students are absolutely being represented. If we're trying to use it to understand what students that are failing on aggregate or that are not retained, then regardless of indigeneity, the survey is not useful at all for either of those activities. And you would argue that the absence of those students is not just about representativeness of their voice, it's actually about response bias, because those students have a very different experience than those that are successful. So the likelihood that their responses are going to be mimicking or mirroring these students, i.e. could you weight up their population to try and get some representativeness? You couldn't do that because there is that non-response bias. Thank you, I'm nearly done. Skip in. So this is then sort of saying, what if we just pulled out those non-successful students? So, i.e. we can't use the whole of unit survey and say we can use that for formulating retention and success strategies, but what if we just picked out the non-successful and the non-retained students, the few responses we do have, is there enough of them to at least get something out of that? And so what I looked at is, if you analyse that data just for an individual collection period, so one survey period, which is a teaching period, versus if you aggregated together at least 4 teaching periods. And really what we found here is, at the individual semester level, there's not enough confidence to be able to say, just take out the non-retained and non-successful students from the surveys and then analyse that to get your indications of what we need to do. But if you aggregate 4 together, there is enough statistical reliability, until you remember there is non-response bias, which says that, okay, yes, whilst you can counter for this statistical reliability, there's missing students from the population that have a different experience. So key findings really are that, what I just summarised then, but really students are underrepresented. The predominant component that's contributing to that underrepresentation is the fact that non-successful and non-retained students are not represented in the survey, and we know that Indigenous students at the moment have about a 10% gap in their success rates and their response rates between non-Indigenous students. So achieving parity in some of those outcomes will likely achieve parity in survey response rates. But at the moment it means the survey response rates themselves can't be used on their own to formulate success and retention strategies at the university. One of the things we could do is change the tool to try and make it more fit for purpose, to try and lead our retention and success strategies. We need to be careful that that doesn't change the tool to take it away from what it was originally designed to do, which is evaluate individual teaching and learning performance and give an individual lecturer feedback on their teaching experience. So there's a balancing act there between making sure that we maintain that impact, that intent, while still giving us macro level indicators. We could also do some things in terms of achieving better results around sample stratification, so managing some of those underrepresented cohorts, so particularly international students that are young, trying to get them engaged. But ultimately, the success factors are not known until after the survey is completed. We don't know about aggregate performance rates because the survey needs to be completed before grades are released, and we don't know about future year retention until after the fact. So trying to identify and manage that in the strata is virtually impossible. And obviously weighting up the surveys would just compound the non-response bias that's already actually in the data. So the very short answer is, at the moment those surveys aren't fit for purpose for using for formulation of student success and student retention strategies, either for Indigenous students or the broader university population, because they're missing a significant component of those students from the voice. So we would need to supplement that with some other bits of research to understand how different those non-responding students are from the responding students. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. There's a body of research that suggests that your laggers in the response rates are more like the missing people from the responses. So if we look just at those who respond really late in the survey period, are they likely to be like the ones not responding? There's another body of research that suggests that you can do qualitative analysis to try and, I guess, compare the views of those that are responding compared to the views of those that aren't responding, to then understand, can we extrapolate out from the responses to represent that other group. So they're the sort of things that we would be looking to do in the future to try and make this more robust.